Welcome to session 4. This topic is the originations of monotheism, Mithraism, and Zoroastrianism. Based off of the prior talks, we have talked around all elements of Abrahamic religions. We started with the New Age and spiritualism, which was our kind of going out there and modern. Then we did the celestial hierarchy in order to gain the understanding of the mysticism inside of Christianity and how it's got these stranger elements. Then we did Gnosticism, which would cover the exterior to Christianity or a different development from its same origination points, more or less. And now we're talking about the ground that it sprang from. So as we'll see throughout this talk, monotheism didn't come out of nowhere in a certain way. It came out of a former movement prior to Christianity's formation. Our talk on Mithraism is extra fascinating in my mind because it's going to answer a lot of questions that we normally don't ask. So this whole talk will cover the essential elements of Christianity and where they're all inherited from. So, as I will repeat towards the end in some variety, Mithraism is a lot of the meat of Christianity. It's where it got a lot of its meat, and it got its bones from Zoroastrianism. So some things taken, some things left, but we're going to give the whole smorgasbord. So in order to talk about Mithraism, I have to start with saying kind of more of its historical reference. So it was a competitor to early Christianity. So we're talking about 300 CE. And there was a competition, normally at the beginning, Christianity was very much the other. It was very different and kind of an outcast. So it would have been more of a new age concept from the beginning. So thus people would have wiped it off kind of in the same way that new age is wiped off by modern Christianity. However, Christianity became the state religion in 312. So this is a very contentious decision, and there were efforts to flip this decision because a lot of the culture of Rome at this time was Mithric, or they were part of the Mithras initiations. However, it stayed this way, and by the 4th century, Theodosius is the one accredited with giving anti-pagan decrees and thus splintering Mithraism in its public sector. So, what is Mithras, right? Mithras is effectively the simplest way that we can understand it is Mithras is the sun god. The greater belief it represented a system of ethics of which brotherhood was a big part, and that everybody should unify against the forces of evil. So we got a little taste of Christianity there. The worshippers of Mithras held beliefs about the celestial heaven and infernal hell. So again, the concept of this polarity was inherited, the heaven, the celestial heaven, and the inferno, the burning hell, was not original to Christianity by any means. And we don't find that so much in Judaism. They believed in the benevolent power of the god Mithras, which would sympathize with them from, relieving their suffering and grant them things. This is what they ultimately wanted. They wanted the final justice of immortality and eternal salvation in the world to come. Again, this is very reminiscent. And when we're talking about Zoroastrianism later, we'll see how these two are very much a mixed bag. It's very complicated. But so they, Mithrics or Mithraist practitioners, looked forward to a final day of judgment, Revelations-esque, in which the dead would resurrect, and there would be a final conflict to destroy the existing order of all things and to bring about a triumph of light over darkness. Services were held on Sundays, in which bells were sounded and praises were offered to their god Mithras. On big occasions, the soldiers of Mithras, as they were called, took part in a sacrament of bread and wine, and we're going to talk about that later, as bulls, sacred bulls, were sacrificed. So we're going to dissect all of this, including that. I want to touch again on the fact that it's Sundays now. Christianity took this, right? And Sundays are the days of rest, and so it's no accident, because this was taken from Mithraism, this Sunday ritual. And mind you, in order to convert these people in Rome, Christianity would have had to take in a lot of them. It would have had to appropriate a lot of their ceremonies. So it seemed like almost a seamless transition. So Christianity wasn't alone in this regard at all. It very much seems like, again, I've made an analogy before, it seems like Frankenstein's monster. So they worship Sundays because the sun is Mithras, and that was their main god. Now, it is pagan. This belief was pagan, but Mithras was their ultimate god. So it was the one that kind of usurped all gods, even greater than, say, how Zeus did in the Greek pantheon. It was viewed as a complete upper to all of the other minor deities, to the point where they were only interested in worshiping essentially the top, and they would acknowledge the lesser gods, but still this would be considered pagan. So let's talk about this bull worship, which I think is particularly fascinating, because still to this day we see in Hinduism the worshiping, or the not eating of cows, and we always see bulls included in all sorts of mythic representations. And lo and behold, in the modern day, which we'll touch on a little bit now, we see the Spanish ritualistic killing of the bull, and in Mexico too, and in the U.S. we have the rodeo, bull riding, where is this rooted in? So the ritual sacrifice of the bull symbolized the penetration of the feminine by the masculine. I know this is a little bit to dissect. In an easier way, the slaying of the bull represented man's victory of his spiritual nature over the kind of mundaneness and banality of his animal nature. So this was to pay reverence. By slaying the bull, we are symbolically killing the ignorant part of ourselves, or the not conscious part of ourselves, and embracing the spiritual part of ourselves. So this is what it started in, and the bull represents this kind of masculinity by the nature of its size, its strength, and its it's a sexual vigor, essentially. And, mind you, the horns come to represent their own thing too, but we're going to keep this moving along. So throughout ancient history, and even when we were talking about the Christian celestial hierarchy too, the angels took the face of a bull. And this specific aspect, astrologically speaking as well, it represents, as I've mentioned before, but strength and vigor. And so we see this kind of sprinkled all throughout history. And of course, the one that most people would know is that the Greek myth of the Minotaur and the half-man, half-bull monster in the labyrinth beneath Crete. Why is this really significant to them? So the idea was that Mithras was, one of the first entities in the early cosmos before anything. And the first creature, the first living creature ever, was a bull. This was the animal nature. So again, this could be symbolic, or we can take it literally. The first living creature is the bull. And Mithras, this is the story as it is. It took the bull by the horns and dragged it into a cave. And as I'll mention later, a cave in their mind represents the universe. So there's something very cosmic happening here. The bull escaped, then it was recaptured, and through a series of events that involve a crow and a dog being created and coming to help, Mithras seizes the bull by the nostrils, right underneath, and plunged a knife deep in the flank of its side, and the bull died. And the world came into being, and time was born from this, because the bull was immortal, and by killing it, by having the means to kill it, would effectively spread out its essence. So again, it's immortal, and it wants, well, here, give me one moment. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to pull up some pictures for you guys later. Where did I leave off? So from the spinal cord of the bull, all manner of wheat was produced. From the blood, produced the first wine. From its body, being and time was born. And from its I think it's other parts of its body as well, all herbs and plants came to the earth. So this is effectively, the bull is representing a few things here.
I can't.
There we go. Again, our animal nature, but a big note here is that we want to understand that the bull also represented the age of Taurus. So in this way, it's an astrological symbol as well. The transition of Mithras slaying the bull was to slay Taurus and move into the age of Aries. So later we'll see that Mithras was also accredited with changing fate, with changing the nature of man by killing the bull. So this is the real kind of nitty-gritty that I'm personally interested in, because this is where we get a lot of the esotericism that we don't know where it comes from, and it's always about Mithraism. So let me just explain a little bit further. So this bread ceremony that we do and wine ceremony that we do in classic Christianity, right? There's specific names not coming to mind right now. So in Mithraism, the ceremony with the bread was inscribed with a cross inside of a circle. And this represented the sun. This was the alchemical symbol of the sun. However, the difference here, most notably, was that the wine was laced with Amanita muscaria, which is the quintessential hallucinogenic drug. And this would have not been very strange in that time, because even now we see bishops of the Vatican dress up like they are an Amanita muscaria mushroom. Like they have the cap on top. There's a lot of very reasonable hypothesis about the Eleusinian mysteries or the Elysian mysteries of the Greeks partaking in the mushroom as this kind of direct source to godhood. So this original wine and bread ceremony would have been a lot more notable in that time, as it's been appropriated in Christianity. Now, the virgin birth too, Mithras was specifically born on the 24th or 25th, and this of December, I mean, and this was more to do with a miscalculation of the winter solstice, because it was this, again, a symbolic act where it was viewed as, how do I best put this? the sun is returning now. It's gone from its coldest, and now the sun is starting to return. So thus it is born, Mithras, the sun god, is born on this day of the winter solstice. And again, they have a miscalculation, but that's where we get this date of the 24th and 25th, of which now is Christ's birth. And again, this can be viewed as an appropriation of the Mithras story. And the born of a virgin birth, we'll get to that a little bit more later. Now, what I find really interesting as well is the symbolism of colors. So we associate Christmas with the green, the red, and the white. And in this time, in Iranian culture in particular, in the Persian culture, it represents the caste system. So the green is the farmers. And to those of you who have been neophytes or initiates in sororities in colleges, and I know that they've stopped hazing as much, but you would dress up in green as a neophyte, because the green represented the lowest of the caste system, the farmers. You would upgrade to red when you were dignified as a soldier, and then you would update to white when you were a royal. It's the royal color. So we see this in the Iranian flag, in the Tajikistani flag. We see this in the Kurdish flag, in the Bulgarian flag, which, you know, the Bulgarian, the Bulgarians were ruled over by a Persian empire for a large portion of their history, if you want to look into the history of the Balkans. And then lastly, the Italian flag, which is where Mithraism had its great kind of resurgence and reinvention. So there are the Christmas colors, and again, we'll see them on all the flags, of which were touched by the Iranian culture and of which this originated from in the Iranian culture. So these flags have Christmas colors, and that's no accident. So the Santa Claus figure, and there's a lot of ways that we can further dissect this that go outside of the topic, but for our purpose, the hat that he wears, and that Smurfs wear too, is a Phrygian cap, which is worn by Mithras. So if you look up Mithras and pictures of Mithras, in its historical depictions, he's wearing this hat while killing the bull. So you can see this kind of sulking cap. And the red that Santa Claus wears is this appropriation of what Scythian, so that's an ancient group of people who held these beliefs, the Scythians, riding outfits looked like. They were red because of this association with Mithras and the red sun and fire, which we'll be talking about quite a bit. So there's no accident of the symbolism of Santa Claus, and not to mention that the red and the white are part of the Amanita muscaria mushroom, right? That's what it looks like. And based off of old paganism, during this time would be when they would come bring the mushroom down. The shamans would come bring the mushroom down. So Santa Claus comes with the magic. So it's this mix of paganism, but very much rooted in Mithraism. So the one that I think is really cool, because now we're starting to dig into the Masonic. So the Statue of Liberty has this crescent head. You know, it's got this crescent on top. And out from there has these outshining rays from the ends of her head. And in the same way, if you look up depictions of Mithras, you'll see this same, it was actually not so much of a crescent as it was the curly hair at this portion and the early portion of the upper head. And then out there was the outshining lights, which you also see in depictions of Zoroaster, and you also see in depictions of Jesus, but it was most accredited for Mithras and the highest initiation of Mithraism. This was very notably, it was a Freemason who created the Statue of Liberty. So this was an homage. So when we see the Statue of Liberty, in the Freemason's mind, this is a giant sculpture to Mithras, to honor Mithras. So although we might associate it with liberty and all these things in our kind of exoteric understanding, for the Masons, this is an embodiment of Mithras. So another side note too. So I kind of mentioned it, but this cult, the initiates would worship in caves off the coast. So as I sort of mentioned, caves were analogous to the universe. And so you see how they inherited this Plato's cave allegory. And in which case, Plato's cave is not viewed as a simple cave or just the realm of our own minds, but it's also that Plato's cave is the universe itself. And the concept would be to escape the universe, that the hero, that realizes what's going on escapes. Now, a few other shocking notes. We also inherit the salute that the military does, most notably the salute from Mithraism. It symbolized shielding your eyes from the glory of either Mithras, the king, or the military commander, or the royal initiate. So this would be their kind of greeting. And in the same way, the handshake was a secret handshake. Like initially, this was the original secret handshake that just caught on to everybody, because Mithras, in its original conception, was the god of contracts. And so, what do we do when we agree to something? We shake hands on it, and this is something that we've inherited from the first initiates of Mithraism. So even something as simple as a salute and a handshake is tied to this. Now, in a similar vein, we all know what has been done with the symbol of the swastika. And some of us might know that this is found in India and Buddhism, and it seems like something very different. Now, there's a claim that this symbol was inherited from Mithraism because it did spread all the way up to Mongolia in the ancient times. But it was originally a representation of the bear constellation around the North Star. So the North Star would be in the middle, and the bear constellation would stretch on the kind of four legs outside of the North Star. And they claim that this is the place where Mithras tilted, in the North Star in particular, tilted the astrological heavens and changing the age from, again, Taurus to Aries, and thus changing the fate as it was ordained by the Lord of Time. And so in this way, we look at it again, that the bull was representing as the Lord of Time, or Kronos, and that slaying the bull was slaying the kind of defeatist, nihilistic fate of humanity. And Mithras changing this at this point of the North Star, the swastika, would have been viewed as a symbol of spiritual triumph. So again, here we're dealing with all these old things: the salute, Santa Claus, the Statue of Liberty, Christmas colors, even the bread and wine, right? And all of them have this different sort of meaning and have been appropriated in time so that we don't understand where it's initially coming from. So it is a bit of an oversimplification to say that Mithraism was the early forerunner of Christianity, because again, this is a bit more complicated than it might seem. And aside from Christ, a lot of deities went through this kind of resurrection that Jesus is accredited for. So Mithras went through the resurrection. Osiris went through the resurrection. Tasmus, Adonis, Balder, Attis, Dionysus, even classical heroes, Perseus, Theseus, Hercules, they all had these similar traits. The former had the traits of having died and coming back, and the latter were born from the union of a virgin mother and a divine father. It's very frequent in Greek myth that we see that kind of trope. So again, that's not something that's entirely unique. So Mithras in particular was born of a virgin mother, and they called her Anahita, I believe, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It was a fertility goddess before Reformation. And Anahita conceived the savior from the seed that Zarathustra preserved in the waters of Lake Hammon. So again, right here is the first time I've mentioned Zarathustra. So as I'm going to explain later, Mithraism and Zoroastrianism are very strangely intertwined with one another. They are distinct, but they also are kind of strange homages to each other. Mithraism includes Zoroaster and the gods of Zoroastrianism, and vice versa. So before I get there, I'm still going to give a bit more context as to Mithraism. And the way that we should understand it is that this was a mystery cult. It's a secret society that we have inherited for an unknown amount of time. This isn't just Rome. It had a resurgence in Rome, but it wasn't born out of there. This was born out of Iran. And we could argue of its workings in Egypt as well, since a lot of these myths are inherited. So the rites of this secret society would be the same way as we see with the Masons now. You go through realms of initiation, and then the more you initiate, the more that they tell you. So this is a trope. This is as old as, what, human history, if we want to go that far. So it's kind of similar to the rites of Demeter, Dionysus, or Orpheus in the Greek tradition. There's a lot of similarities in its kind of secret ceremonies. But the neophyte in this tradition, so the neophyte just simply means the new one, the one who's being introduced, had to prove their courage in initiation by swimming across a rough river. They had to descend a sharp cliff, and they had to jump through flames with their hands bound and their eyes blindfolded to show their devotion to the initiation. Mind you, this is all symbolic as well. The initiate was taught a password specific to Mithraism. And in the same way, you see these depictions, you knock at that dark door, say the password. What's the password? Okay, the password's this. Okay, now you can enter. You are an initiate. We know that it's you. And, in order to learn this, they would have to repeat it all the time as a mantra, because if they got it wrong, that would be big trouble. So what did they believe, essentially? I kind of mentioned it before that there's some real analogies to Christianity in their beliefs. So they believed that the human soul descended into the world at birth. So that's a bit of a distinction. We don't get a lot of an explanation from Christianity in that regard. The goal of life is a religious quest, and it is to achieve the soul's ascent out of the world, again, by gaining passage to the 7 heavenly gates. And so these heavenly gates were represented by the 7 grades of initiation. And after death, it would have been the 7 different celestial spheres. So the first one would have been the moon, and so forth. So being promoted to the highest rank of the religion was believed to correspond to the heavenly journey of the soul, so that there was an analogous nature. We would represent the simulation of death in the simulation of life. So there would be, of course, a lot of kneeling. There would be a lot of nakedness. Nakedness would be viewed as casting off the old life, so that would normally be a part of an initiation ceremony. And mind you, all of this is in a coastal cave, which I think that's pretty cool, personally. It would all surmount in this liberation from the bondage of not knowing, of understanding the mysteries. So quickly, and I'm not going to go through each of them, but the grades, the 7 grades of Mithraism were and I'm not saying the real words here, but it was the raven, the male bride. This is where they would dress up like a woman. They would embody androgynousness, or the opposite gender. And mind you, no women are allowed. That's a thing, as is true with Freemasons today, mind you. Then the next would be the soldier. The next would be lion. The next would be Persian, which is an interesting thing. Then Sunrunner, and then you are father from that point forward. And mind you, we use the word father, right? Catholicism now, and each with their respective grades represented by the celestial spheres, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, so forth. And of course, the father is the sun, and that's Mithras. So the side note here is when I mentioned before that Christianity was very interested in doing away with Mithraism, it wasn't necessarily just Christianity, because Christianity was a kind of concoction, you could say, if you want to interpret it like this, made by Rome, because they in particular didn't like Mithraism. That it came to be so ingrained in the culture, especially of the military, because it had Persian roots, and Persia was the sworn enemy of the state. So if you want to make it analogous now, it would be as if in the States there's this strange case of Islamophobia, and so if to those in power who seem rather ignorant, just generally speaking, saw that Islam was coming in and very much being taken in by the grain of the whole society, they would want to concoct something to kind of get that out, right? That's how they would think. And in the same way, this is how Rome felt about Mithraism. And anyway, so now I want to get to the point where we talk about the conception of monotheism in the ancient world. Again, as I've mentioned, Mithraism does have this characteristic of being monotheistic in the sense that Mithras is the one above all in a certain way, but there are other gods in the mix, and there are some other characteristics that make it declared as pagan. But Zarathustra, or Zoroastrianism, is a kind of different story, and we can debate on how old each one is. And Zoroastrianism has been claimed as far as 6,000 years ago, and conventionally understood to be as old as about 4,000 years ago. And in Zoroastrianism, there is a hierarchical system of immortals and the adored ones under the rule of one true God. So this sounds more like the angels and the one true God of Christianity. This is Zoroastrianism in this way is a little bit more reminiscent in this form. And their God is referred to as Ahura Mazda or Ahuran. So within this pantheon of Zoroastrianism, Mithras is gauged as the judger of souls. So in the religion of Zoroastrianism, there's a place for Mithras, and Mithras is referred to as equal to of admiration as Ahura Mazda. So it's this strange kind of thing where Zoroastrianism is kind of sharing the limelight of their god, Ahura Mazda, and Mithras. And generally the conceptions is that Zoroastrianism came later, but we'll get to that. So Mithras in this faith is omniscient, undeceivable, infallible, eternally watching, and never resting, which this aspect is also caught in the Kabbalah in I think it's Geburah as part of the Tetragrammaton, the Tree of Life. This realm, this feeling of judgment, the place where a soul goes to be judged, is a part of Geburah in the Kabbalah and the Tree of Life. But in this case, it is specifically for Mithras. So again, there's this kind of strange bleed between all these faiths. But so in the Avesta, which is the holy book of Zarathustra or Zoroastrianism, is where I'm getting a lot of this talk. And when I mentioned before that Mithras was associated with the contract, it's made more explicit in Zoroastrianism. Literally, Mithras means contract in Persian. So you can't get out of your contracts, right? Like if you've made a deal, you will pay it back. There will be a vengeance. And this is the embodiment that Mithras takes in Zoroastrianism. And Ahura Mazda is just the creator. It's the one above all. So there's not so many qualities ascribed to him. So Mithras is more of the actor, it's the doer. And Ahura Mazda is just the Godhead. And this is distinct again. So Mithras in this faith was seen as a protector of good souls, and the one who would kind of fight back the demons and make sure that you're kept safe from demons since you're righteous. But he, of course, wouldn't protect the ones that weren't righteous. And that according to these traditions, the god Mithras was actually incarnated into human form that was prophesized by Zarathustra. So they even gave Mithras an embodiment, in of which case it was a virgin birth and so forth. But I'm getting a little complex here, so let's just focus on Zoroastrianism in particular and stop mixing this bag, because like, okay, what they believe. So Zoroastrianism was especially coming into power around the time of this guy Cyrus the Great, who's the king of Persia, and this in particular would be between 1500 and 1200 BC. So mind you, this is quite a bit before Christianity. And Zoroastrian, this belief came out of the religious background of Hinduism. So the world in this area, Iran, India, would have been a faith very similar to what we see in modern day Hinduism. And Zoroaster was a person who was partaking in one of these pagan purification rites. He was 30 years old, and he had this supreme vision while taking part in this pagan ceremony. And in this vision, he came to understand that there was a god beyond all the gods that they worshipped, Ahura Mazda. Side note, you might hear that I'm saying Ahura Mazda, like the car. And yes, that was specifically inspired from Zoroastrianism. The car Mazda was taken from Ahura Mazda. So this is more of the philosophy. Zoroastrian belief. This is the idea of a single God, a ruling God, of heaven, of hell, of a judgment day. And all of these things would have been introduced to the Jews, or what would become the Jews, in Babylonia, where the people of Judea came from while they were living in captivity. So Cyrus, the guy I mentioned, who was a full-on Zoroastrianism, conquered Babylon in 539 BC, and he liberated the Jews from Babylon. So thus they returned to Jerusalem, and their descendants would be the ones that would create the Bible, or the Old Testament. So this symbol, if you look up Zoroastrianism, it depicts a bearded man with one hand reaching forward, and he stands above a pair of wings that are outstretched from a circle. And this specific symbol, it simply represents eternity. That is the main way of understanding it without getting into the nitty-gritty of all of the symbolism. Zoroastrians believed in what they called sky burials. So they believed that the earth was holy, that fire was holy, so we shouldn't burn them and we shouldn't bury them. That would be to desanctify these things. That would be to dishonor these things. So they would build these large towers with a flat top, and they would just chuck your body up there. We could refer to this as dhammas or dakmas, or towers of silence. And here, the corpses would be exposed, to the elements and vultures, and they would have been bleached and, picked dry until they were bones, basically. And then they would have taken the bones and placed them into lime pits called ossuaries. So right away, we feel that this is rather foreign, but philosophically, Zoroastrianism has a lot of these concepts that Christianity will inherit. Most notably, this concept of a supreme good God and an evil lesser God. And we'll get to that in a bit, but a side note that I want to throw in here too is Nietzsche, Nietzsche's book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, being this concept of the overman, of the one who is awakened to truth and who triumphs over the kind of humbug and foolishness of the world. This is a direct reference to Zarathustra. Zarathustra is the Greek word of Zoroaster, or maybe I'm getting it the other way around, but both of these names are from the same person. So, Nietzsche, of course, being an excommunicated preacher in his studies, would have very naturally started digging into this source material that I'm giving out to you guys right now. So let's get back to it. So the afterlife of Zoroastrianism in particular, this is a bit different than what Christianity would inherit. So after death, the body would remain in the world for 3 days and nights. Again, the resurrection took 3 days because the body was still okay. Anyway, and one of the yazatas, or angels, as we refer to them as, would move the soul after 3 days to what we or what they call the Shinvat bridge. So this bridge is again analogous to the rainbow bridge that we see in Nordic mythology, the bridge between the spirit world or other dimensions and the earthly plane. So at the bridge, the soul meets a maiden who is the embodiment of all the good words, thoughts, and deeds of their life. So if they were effectively a bad person, then this maiden would appear as a hag. And if they were a good person, then she would just be immaculate. So this image, whether it was good looking or bad looking, would confront you, or your dead self, and the soul must acknowledge with the image, or with this hag or beautiful maiden, its actions, and to judge yourself, and whether or not you are worthy to cross the bridge. So this is kind of trollish, right? Like, will the troll let you cross, right? And if you get to the other side, then you move on. But if you are sent back, then you must return to Earth to learn further lessons. Now, this seems very reincarnation-esque, the return of the soul, the one who's not done. And we can kind of see this in the inspiration in Asia, in the sense of the karmic wheel of Buddhism, right? Like, if you are that good, you can move on into the new spheres or escape the wheel. But if you are not, then you go back, dude, born again. So this is disagreed upon in some ways. Mind you, it's like any other religion. There's differences in ideas, but that's one understanding. Because like I said before, other understandings would be, it's not the hag and it's not the maiden, it's Mithras who judges. Mithras judges every single person. So it's dependent on what sect we're talking about. So there is the heaven. For the ones that go on, the new place that they go is a heaven. So it's simply an excellent place. There's not a lot to say about it. And evil, absolute evil, not just the ones that are turned around, but absolute evil is sent to hell. So there, again, there's this, there is the polarity, there is the heaven and the hell, but there's also this middle ground, and it's not purgatory, it's reincarnation. So, and this idea of judgment, in Christianity, it's just God who judges you, or we're not really sure who judges you, but in this case, there's different accounts of who judges you. So in the oldest Zoroastrian concepts, heaven and hell are not places in particular, but they're states of mind. And that makes sense, right? Like hell on earth, heaven on earth. And they result from the right or the wrong choices. So this seems like a very secular understanding. Zoroaster spoke of a Druji Damana, or the house of lies. And this was the opposite of this other place, the Gero Damana, or the Gero Damana, the house of song. So these are looser concepts. If you're good, you live in the house of song. And if you're bad, you live in the house of lies. So hell when it is personified by other understandings, by Zoroastrianisms, Zoroastriists, or Zoroastrians, man, I'm getting tongue-tied here. It's depicted as the middle of the earth. So we're ancient people. We wonder about where the darkest place is. And it's not necessarily the night sky. It is because the night sky has all the lights, and we associate the cosmos with the creation of the creator. So when we dig a hole, though, it's really dark down there and the light never touches it. So thus hell is in the middle of the earth, where it's darkest and where it never sees light. And this opposite to Ahura Mazda, their lord, was Angri-Menu, which was the lord of darkness, or the abyss, or the void. And so that's where this evil deity would have been in the middle of the earth along with hell. So that's where we kind of get the reason for why hell in Christianity or any of these other faiths is depicted as being in the middle of the earth. So this is where it gets a bit more simple, because religions have everything to do, in my mind, have everything to do with their effect. So, okay, you believe all these things. What's the effect on you? What does that all translate to? I'm giving you all this mysticism. I'm giving you all this lore and all this story. But, does this mean that you're somebody who's self-righteous and that you think that you're better than others? Does this mean that you're somebody who can kill others freely? Does this mean, right? Because all sorts of beliefs would facilitate sacrificial murders and so forth. And that's a distinction here. So in Mithraism, we did have sacrifice, and that's why it was notably pagan. But in Zoroastrianism, there was no such thing. They would view this as highly taboo. The basic moral principles and the takeaway from Zoroastrianism is three principles: good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Good thoughts is the intention or moral resolution and the right order of things. Good words is the communication of that intention to do good things, to embody love. And good deeds is the realization of the action and of that intention of love. So in this way, it's very simple in its ideal. And we see this in the same way as in the New Testament, where what it's supposed to be, that we're supposed to love everybody except everybody. And this is the main moral basis of Zoroastrianism. The strange thing about it, though, is that the Zoroastrians kind of fell out of grace in certain ways, because they started to do what like many languages do when they make things masculine and feminine, right? Like maybe the chair is masculine, maybe the door is feminine. So in Zoroastrianism, it was more like they started to make everything good and evil. So the fire was holy and it was of Ahura Mazda, but the smoke was of Angri-Menu. So in the same way, there were certain creatures, certain animals that were good and certain animals that were bad. So in time, this divulged into being a highly superstitious religion, where they got very particular about what things you could do, what things you couldn't do, because that's of Angri-Menu, and we need to be good because then we'll move on. And it became very particular. So that was the kind of downfall of when it was a conventional mainstream religion. Most notably too, the creator created humans as a means to take evil out of the world. By humans doing good things, one person at a time, they could effectively expel Angri-Menu from our cosmos, from existence, through our individual actions. So they would have viewed everybody's deeds as important. It's not about what I do, it's about what we all do. So it would be very important to each and every one of them that we all do good, that we do whatever we can to facilitate the improvement of the world. And in this way, it's very similar to Gnosticism, which we talked about a few weeks ago. It's important that we all bring back the light. Otherwise, we will never make this place holy. So some other side notes, and I've got a lot here. This is probably one of my loadest, my biggest research topics so much because so far because there's so much to it. But I'll run through this quickly. In the Mahabharata, like I mentioned, a lot of Zoroastrianism came out of Hinduism. Initially, this idea of monotheism came from this kind of paganism, and it inherited this idea of a celestial battle. So this opening story of the gods or the demons of Angry Menu fighting over certain constellations with the angels of Ahura Mazda and creating these giant battles on Earth too over the fate of humanity. So that's something that Christianity left in the past, aside from strange things like the Nephilim and strange references to the giants that just kind of glosses over. But here they've kept this story. And something that I really want to touch on is that astrology and astronomy was a huge part of not only their Bible, the ashas of their texts, but was a huge part of how the Bibles were written too, because they're full of astrological components. So if you pick up an old astrological text that tells you when good crops will grow and when bad crops will grow, it'll say like this star will grow orange or this star will grow red. And it was all written in this kind of omen fashion. Well, in the same way, in the ashas, it sounds a lot like you're reading an astrology book. So just as a kind of reference, the month Tyr, which is their own month, is the fourth month of the year, and Cancer, the fourth constellation from Aries. So it is the owner of Cancer, into which Tishtar, which is a whole other thing, sprang and displayed the characteristics of producing rain. And so again, the same mention of this astrological formation brings water and strength of the wind. So it's very prophetic. And why I want to bring this up is because in the Bible, we have the three wise men or the three magi who knew of the coming of Christ and who were there. And this is the nod to Zoroastrianism in the Bible. They were magi, and the word magi is coming from Iranian, and it's coming from the priests, the maguses of Zoroastrianism. So that's where it's rooted in. And the very concept of magic is rooted in these magi. And in which case they were prophetic. They were able to discern, to do divinations through the stars. And if you know anything about the history of the Middle East and its sophistication in astronomy, I mean, you could say that this was all inherited from Zoroastrianism. There was a big interest and a big fascination in the religion itself of this kind of thing that we associate with science, of knowing the stars, of knowing and having names for all these things. So the other thing that I want to mention is that the difference in concept here, just to kind of distinguish Zoroastrianism too, is that when first the world was created, and then the sky, and then water, the earth, plants, and then animals, and last was mankind. So in Gnosticism, mankind was first before any creation. And in Zoroastrianism, we have mankind as the last thing to show up. And before all this, I believe, if I've read it correctly, the celestial sphere and the constellations were created. And they all share the same kind of attributes as normal Greek pantheism. So we have astrology really deep woven into this form of Christianity or monotheism, which is something that Christianity would do away with, other than these weird references to science here and there. But instead of Aries being a ram, it would have been a lamb. Otherwise, essentially everything's the same. Right down to Sagittarius being a centaur. I guess the last one would be that Aquarius, the only difference there is that it wasn't the water bearer, it was literally a water pot. So on the nature of evil, this does share a lot like it does in Christianity. It was created by Angry and through the demon's devotion to witchcraft, it seduces mankind into affection for himself. So he believes himself greater than everything else. And the disaffection for Ahura Mazda, or the greater fabric of things, or the original creator. And so in them forsaking Ahura Mazda, and by doing these acts of worshiping themselves, they are empowering Angry Menu and the evil spirit's ability to be able to take over the world. So every bad person would collectively, in the same way as every good person would collectively. So the fate of if the universe would have been eternally good in paradise, or if it would have been eternally damned in hell, depended on everybody's actions. And that's a different kind of dilemma, but it still has this remnant of what Christianity is. So, that's why it would have been very important that that's also what would have led to the neuroticism of the kind of don't do this, but do this, don't do this, but do this. It's very important that everybody acts this way. And you can see how that could become oppressive in time. So in the same way as one might expect in these ancient faiths especially, they had a very sophisticated demonology. There's a lot of notes there, and I don't really see this as much in the old paganism. I mean, there always were demons, but to have this kind of conception of higher demons, lower demons, and them all being in service to one ruling figure, I mean, it just seems rather unique to me in the inheritance of Abrahamic religion. So they had angels and they had demons. They had heaven, they had hell. And they also, as I mentioned before, had the end times. And this simply means that eventually, when all of humanity has done all the good things, they would reach a place where God could come forward, and he sets or creates a vault in which evil is trapped in metal, it says. And he brings, he flattens the whole world into a slopeless, iceless plain, and no mountains and no shadows. And the summit of the world would support the bridge that I mentioned earlier, the Chinwad Bridge. And in this case, the earth is turned into eternal utopia here. Here is eternal utopia. This realm of which we exist is transformed. So that's the kind of unique twist here. Some Christians interpret that everyone just goes to heaven, which is a whole different place apparently. And then some Christians might say that in this same way, we get this understanding from Zoroastrianism, that eternal utopia is here. This place is changed. And we also see this in a certain offshoot of Gnosticism, where they believed that they should do whatever they please as long as they brought the light here and they outshined the Demiurge. So in this way, it is a utopic religion, which I find beneficial, or at least has a glimmer of optimism to it. It's not all this kind of doom and gloom, and you guys go somewhere and you guys go to a better place, but it's like everybody unites and everybody will return. That's the other thing. Everybody gets brought back from the past. The first people who died are brought back first, and the very last person who died is brought back last. And every soul takes place in the endless utopia that is the reformed earth of complete and full spiritual enlightenment and facilitation of the light of Angry Menu. So that is that's a lot of the bones, and that's a lot of the flesh. Again, as a quick wrap up, the ideas and the traditions of the ceremonies of Christianity came from Mithraism. and the concept of monotheism, and specifically this great God and this evil God. And a lot of these ethical things that we find, the references to the Magi too, as more technical details, as more specific details, these two beliefs, Mithraism, Zoroastrianism, are what substantiated and what propagated and what allowed for Christianity to really come through. And ultimately, historically, now we're going to finish this on a historical note. Zoroastrian strong dualism and the remnants of the excommunicated Mithras would form the heretical belief of Manichaeanism, which was related to Gnosticism, which that would be hunted down further. So after the Mithrians were destroyed and they went underground, Manichaeism was the kind of ground between Christianity, Gnosticism, and the excommunicated Mithrians. And Zoroastrianism had to recede to the Middle East. And once Islam came into power, Zoroastrianism, its worship was taxed heavily, and its fire temples were completely destroyed and replaced by mosques. Their libraries were burned. So in the same way, we kind of see like what the Christians were doing, Islam did in the Middle East. So they're very akin to each other in this way. And in that, Islam forcibly converted Zoroastrians to Islam through coercion and brute force, much in the same way as we saw in the Inquisitions. So in the outskirts of the Middle East, in the Asia Minor, Christian priests deliberately would extinguish the fire of Zoroastrians of their temples and would destroy it because they accused them of serving false gods and of worshiping natural elements, which is something that they used to kill the pagans, basically. So Islam and Christianity were not good to Zoroastrianism, regardless of its indebtedness to it. However, Zoroastrianism is still around. Somewhere between 100,000 and 120,000 people are still Zoroastrians. You're going to find them mostly in India and Iran. Freddie Mercury's parents, and he grew up in a Zoroastrian home. And Mithraism obviously survives in the occult and the Freemasonic orders that are still around today. And any really secret society owes a big homage in its initiations and its symbolism to Mithraism. So now that I've said all that, completely overloaded, it's not that this belief that we have now of the commonplace Abrahamic religions, they have ancestors. It was not something completely different. It's not something that came out like a fluke and took over the world because of how different it was. It was something very formulaic. It came out of, there was a growth that allowed Christianity to become a concept. And we can argue about the truths of any of these particular faiths, but we do owe an indebtedness if we call ourselves Christians. Then we owe an indebtedness to Zoroastrianism, and we should investigate it and the transgressions from it. And if we are to really pay attention to history and the formation of secret societies, of these strange orders in the past, then Mithraism is really where it's at. It's got a very crucial part in Babylon, and all the way into the modern day. I mean, if you see the symbolism and what the Freemasons build, Mithraism is not dead. Like I said, you're going to see it in the Statue of Liberty if you're in the right place. So with all that done, we're going to bring this one to a close.